Welcome everybody. This is our webinar about the role of Nokia in open source and the role of open source in Nokia. We organize the webinar in a way that first we will have a presentation where we discuss a bit about the basics of open source and how and why Nokia is participating in different open source projects. Then we will have a presentation about open positions in Nokia, and after that we will have a panel discussion where we will also answer the questions received during the presentation. In the presentation, we two are presenting. My name is Gregory and I'm working in the Central Open Source Program Office of Nokia. This is a small team, and we are responsible for helping the whole company to navigate in the waters of open source. And my peer in the presentation will be Timo Perala, working for the same team, and we will share with you what do we think about open source and Nokia's role in it. Please ask questions. We really would like to get your questions, and we really would like to be able to answer your questions in the panel. We will have other open source experts in the panel, so it will be not only the two of us talking in the whole time. By scanning the QR code, you can get to the URL where you can put your questions, and also we have the URL in every slide. So if you are not fast enough taking the picture while I'm talking about this, you can still get to the form by typing in the URL. But okay, let's start with the actual material, and first about the, let's say, philosophy of open source. So open source is basically a way to cooperate, and in our industry, this is a way to cooperate between service providers like telecom providers, vendors like ourselves, and even individuals. So everybody is free to contribute to all of these different open source projects, and we together can build something together. And open source is now really global. So there are open source communities which are developing all around the clock. So the development never stops because there are contributors in every continent, and code is getting into the projects all around. And all of these contributors are using online technologies to discuss their ideas and even argue about the different opinions, and then they can build a consensus and build the implementation. This approach is basically changing how software is developed, because it's not only the software vendors anymore who can build software and who can participate in this innovation, but practically everybody who is interested or everybody who sees benefit from participating in these communities. And this model also changed the craftsmanship of software development, because in all of these open source libraries, most of the functionality what anybody would like to implement is most probably already implemented and tuned to perfection. So now it's more like about finding the correct libraries and integrating them together to build something new. And this change happened in the last, let's say, 10 years in the industry, and this is a fundamental change how software is developed. And all of this is enabled by open source, which is basically a licensing model. So by open sourcing, somebody just indicates that they let anybody to investigate the code, use the code, modify the code, and redistribute the code. So this whole chain of, let's say, enablements allows anybody to build on top of the original program not only in a way that you can integrate that as a library or build something on top of the APIs of the program, but anybody can modify the actual code of a library and propose this modification back if they want to the original code. So in this way, the code is developed by what we call a shared R&D of all the developers who are interested to develop that code. And this also means that the competencies are different, what somebody needs to work in this environment. So this is not about finding the best algorithm anymore. It's not about being the best coder or best tester anymore. It is more like a community game. So like people who are participating in these communities have to be able to work together with each other, even if they are, for example, working for competing companies. They need to be able to take a project and develop that together, and everybody have to be able to not strict to their idea that much, and to build a consensus. I think this is a more important competence in working open source than being a good coder, because this is the fundamental way how open source projects are working. That you have to have an agreement with the community, so your code is merged. Other interesting and important point is that open source is not only about source code. So that's of course the core of it, and that's like what is working. But of course there is a need for documentation, because without the proper documentation, nobody will understand what the project is trying to do. So nobody will use it. And if there is no documentation how to contribute to the project, then nobody will contribute to the project. So it will not grow correctly. So documentation is similarly important than the code itself. And of course there are test cases which are guaranteeing the quality of the code. So there are open source projects which are developed in such a pace that without automatic and proper testing, the whole project would just collapse, because they receive so many changes from the contributors that testing all of this change manually is just not working and not scaling. So automatic testing and automatic basically checking everything is also a very important tool in the toolbox of open source projects. So like being able to contribute tests, or even automatic static code analysis to an open source project is very important, because that provides the scale to the project, so they can grow. And there are many more things which are open source. So there are open source projects which are building hardware. So they are sharing hardware blueprints, or even actual hardware plans, and they are building these together, and so on and so on. So open source is, like, of course, most of open source is about software, but the licensing model can be applied to basically anything, even to this talk. So let's talk a bit about licensing, because in open source, that's one thing that somebody needs to produce the code, but there have to be an understanding of the license, so what the license means and what the license requires from the users of the open source. There are different licenses with different requirements. I think the quote-unquote good thing is now licenses are somehow getting standardized. So there are like some licenses which are very prominent, and these licenses are used in, let's say, 80% of the projects. So all of these licenses are, let's say, well known, but of course it's not guaranteed that a well-known license will be used in an open source project. And if somebody uses the open source projects, they really have to understand the license, because these licenses are non-negotiable. So if somebody uses the project, then the license already applies. And there are two types of licenses. So there is one license when somebody uses the project, and in some cases, when somebody contributes to the project, there is another contributors license agreement which guarantees that the project can be used for whatever reason the original authors wanted to use the project. But all of the licenses are basically implementing these quote-unquote 4 freedoms, which are listed in this very big, great box. I think it's not for reading out loud, but these four freedoms are the basics of open source, and these are what I explained previously, that like anybody is free to observe the code, anybody is free to use the code, anybody is free to change the code, and free to distribute the code. So this is like the basic, let's say, dogma of open source. And there are these different licenses are on a scale. So there are licenses which require basically nothing from the users. This is, for example, beerware or VTFPS. So I let you figure out what does it mean. And there are licenses which require a lot of things from the users. Like in case of GPL licenses, there are lots of obligations, but the user of the code need to do to use the license properly. But all in all, the main message is that open source is not only about coding, but you really need to have an awareness of the license, and you need to have a good reason to license your own project with one license or the other. So just think about the licensing. That's the main point. And as I mentioned, there are lots of open source projects out there, and of course there are lots of different governance models of these open source projects. There are different ways how these open source projects are started, how these open source projects are operating, and how these open source projects are growing. So the most obvious and easiest open source project is when somebody just creates a new project on GitHub and starts doing implementation. So that's what we call the person and their dog. So like there are lots of open source projects which are started and maintained by individuals who are interested in technology, or they would like to share something with the world. Maybe they don't even get too much contributions from the outside, but they are very happy about their presence on GitHub, and they are especially happy when, for example, a Linux distribution gets their code and packages it. I have some, I know some people who were like making a party of their code being part of a Linux distribution. And then there are these bigger bottom-up communities, usually started from this like single person, and there was somebody else who was interested in the project, and we started to do things together. They figured out a way to work together, and then this community grew to something very big. One example is, of course, Linux here, which was started by one single person, and now this is the biggest and most developed open source project in the world, and still developed by lots of individuals. The other class of open source projects is something which is, let's say, architected. So when some persons or companies just got together and they wanted to start or solve a common problem, so they figured that they would like to do or initiate an open source project. Examples for this is OpenStack, which was started by Rackspace and NASA at that time, or ONUP, which was started by telecom operators, Kubernetes, which was started by Google and then donated to Linux Foundation. So all of these communities are started by corporations, and it was decided that they will open source the assets of these corporations, and they are now operating as open source projects. And there are open source projects which are driven by still single companies. Like, for example, Android, I think that's the most prominent example. So that is controlled by Google and driven by Google. Or Docker, the container runtime, it is driven by Mirantis. And there is also a bit of a gray zone here, what we call a shared source. So these projects are really like not only controlled on strategy level, but really on quote unquote every commit level. So for example, in Confluent case, all of their like people who can accept contributions to the project are working for the same company. So this is a bit of a gray zone, because this is an open source project, but still they are really looking the interest of one single company. So how this problem can be solved, if it's a problem? So how to make a project grow and scale in terms of governance? So how to make lots of people working together. And there are like different phases of these, and this can be different in projects in time also, like they can go from one to another. So as I mentioned, most of the open source projects are started by one person, and if that person remains the leader of the project and that person makes the important decisions, that is called the benevolent dictator for life governance model. So this is like one single person who is the dictator for the project. And I think this is okay for projects, because not all the projects have to build like all of this governance structure. The most important thing is to make it clear, like who is the person who is responsible for the decisions in the project. And then of course, like when a project is growing, there are usually a set of people popping up around this dictator who are interested in the project, who know the project. Maybe they know different areas of the project, so they will be trusted by this dictator that they also can merge code to the project, so they can accept others' contributions or even their own. So these are becoming what we call the dedicated committers or maintainers. So this is a group of dedicated persons who can change the code or who can approve change by others. So this is just another level of the governance. And then if the project grows bigger, or there are bigger interests, let's say like companies also playing a role in the life of the project, then they can start build these interest groups, or even like steering committees or subcommittees, or different governance structures around the projects. And finding the right governance for the project is very important, because if there is a project which, I don't know, have only 1,000 lines of code, it doesn't really make sense to create a big steering committee for it and have regular steering meetings and so on and so on. But in case of bigger projects, they really need, let's say, a continuous steering from these steering committees, a continuous forum where people invested into the project can discuss how to drive the project, or what are the important problems of the project. It's very important to mention that most of these steering committees, for example, are not about technical decisions of the actual project, but it's about the surroundings of the project, like what kind of code review tool to use, or how to make the continuous integration better. So these kind of things decided in these steering committees. And this enables the scaling of the project to like very big, and the enablement of it enables the involvement of thousands of developers. Okay, then just another aspect of different open source projects. So these open source projects are sometimes hosted by the individuals who are working on them. Like somebody just creates a new project on GitHub, and the open source project lives there. But bigger open source projects are usually under the governance of a foundation, and there are lots of these foundations dealing with different type of open source projects. Most prominent is the Linux Foundation, which is not equal to Linux itself. So the Linux Foundation hosts lots of other projects, including Linux itself. And there is also the Open Infrastructure Foundation, which hosts cloud infrastructure related open source projects, and there are many others. They are dealing with different areas of the software technology, and they have these projects to operate. They have projects with, for example, legal support in case of need. They have to create the funding documents of these projects, and so on and so on. So they really provide a good framework to work in these open source projects. But as I said, like if somebody just starts a project, a very small one, you don't need to create a foundation for that, or you don't need to go to a foundation for that. Individuals can host their own open source projects also. Then let's cover a bit the benefits of open source. So why is it good to invest in this model of software development, and why companies are interested in it? Because open source is mostly developed by developers working for companies. So like in these bigger open source projects, companies are investing lots of developers to work on the project, and it's only the minority of the developers who are doing it for their own fun. So these are really like persons working on these projects and paid by corporations. So why corporations are interested in using and contributing to open source? And one thing is the openness. So by using open source and contributing to open source, there is no vendor lock-in, because the open source projects are public. Anybody can just take them and start to use them. So there are, even if a vendor provides an open source project as a supported service, it is very easy to move to another vendor's offering providing the same open source project in a bit different, with a bit different logo or something like that. So this is happening, for example, with Kubernetes. That is a very prominent container orchestration platform, and there are different offerings of Kubernetes from, for example, Red Hat, Ubuntu, or even public solutions like Google or AWS. So all of these companies are providing the same thing, which means that if a product is not happy, or if somebody is not happy with the offering of one of them, they can just go to another, and everything is compatible and working nicely. The other very important aspect is this joint R&D and joint innovation. So this really enables the industry to build something together and solve the common problems of the industry together, and this is the most direct way how customers can influence products if they just implement it themselves. This also somehow relates to the to learning. So by participating in these open source projects, the individual developers can really learn from each other. They can really learn how what are the best practices of the development, and also like from the design of the projects, different companies can learn to which direction the industry is moving. And of course, because of this shared R&D, there are lots of resources which can be directed to these open source projects, so they are developed much faster than different companies' solutions. So this is also a very important aspect of open source development, and why companies are investing in open source. It's just faster to develop things with this development model. And of course, there is the security aspect, which is very important nowadays in every part of the world. And because open source is developed in an open way, so anybody can see the code and anybody can review the code which is merged, open source solutions are very safe, because it's very difficult to put, let's say, bad code into the open source project because of this public review process. And of course, there are lots of testing happening, as I mentioned, like all of this automatic testing. They are testing the security aspects of these projects also. And because of the testing and lots of automation, the quality of these open source projects usually really good, because it's in their DNA to automatically test basically everything. So this is why, like, companies in general are interested in open source, but why telecom companies are interested. And to answer that question, I hand over to Timo.
Thank you, Pirko. Okay. So yes, good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm Timo Perälä, like Pirko already introduced in the beginning, at the Nokia Open Source Program Office, or what comes closest to such. And I will now cover the aspects of open source a little bit more from Nokia angle. All that Pirko already presented obviously applies to us, but this is now really a little bit closer to home, if you like. So with this very simplistic timeline, sort of couple of aspects to open source and Nokia's business, or telco, to start with. So a few decades ago, it all started, and there was obviously the first interest was with the kind of computer things in general, and that was not at all specific to telecoms at that time. So things were on that part of so computer science and so forth was the kind of the cradle of the whole thing, and this continued for quite some time. So coming to the 90s, early 2000s, we did have some interesting open source projects which already did have a role to play also in telco industry, but not directly and only. One interesting historical data point, of course, is what you can see, the DX200 there. I guess that doesn't say anything to anybody, but you have the link there for further studies. So that was the very interesting switching platform that Nokia created by itself, for itself, but it was based partially, the kernel part of it was based partially on a Unix flavor, if you like. So already in early days there was some open source with our products. So then some more interesting open source projects start to emerge, and companies started to pay attention to. In the beginning, the heavy emphasis was on kind of using open source, so not that much getting involved, but capitalizing on what the good people out there were producing. Then moving towards closer today, we start to see those acronyms popping up there after like 2010 or so. There are many of them that are actually only for telco. I mean, fully to that, starting from stuff like OPNFV or TIP or ONAP or those kind of acronyms that we love so much. They are all only for telecom. So there are big projects out there that are for telecom industry and run by telecom industry and developing open source for telecom industry. And this is where we have now kind of moved from using open source only to contributing. So our role has also changed during the decades. And therefore, for example, this webinar here. From Nokia's R&D point of view, or kind of thinking why do we do it, I think Gregory somewhat already touched on that, but just wanted to kind of build on that we have this concept of shared R&D, and that's the open source. And in our view, and we've witnessed it, that it increases. So the use of shared R&D in Nokia is in rise. So there are some products that have a lot of it, more than half of the code base. Of course, some others have less, but it's still kind of the steady growth there. So it is something where the community kind of develops things for us, and that is an important movement, therefore, for us. And since we want to be part of that, we need to have our own development somehow adapted to the ways of that working. So there is kind of a cultural aspect to it. So it cannot be only that in Kara there are good engineers that hack away only within our own premises. They need to be able to work with the other folks and be able to contribute and enhance the open source. And we don't have the luxury to keep our own processes and separate from the open source processes. So we need to put them somehow together so that they fit. So that's why it's part of the. That's why we say it's part of the development with us. But then, of course, we are in the business of making money, or making money for the shareholders. So there has to be some reason why like Erko said, if there is an open source solution from company A or B, the user can choose. But we have to come up with something that they don't want to change us to somebody else. Therefore, this differentiation. So not all is open source. We do have certain areas where we put our own brains and develop stuff that the others don't. So there is a clear distinction there, but still doesn't take anything away from the value of the open source. And then so that was kind of a business, in quotes, business justification. And then there is the kind of what does it bring to Nokia that we are there actively. So already covered that it's part of pretty much all of our products, but we also see this open source as a way to agree across the industry. Because telecom industry is an environment where you need to agree with your customers and your competitors how this big machine works, because nobody builds it by themselves only. There has to be something from the other folks as well, and they have to work together. So we see this open source as one part of that alignment game, if you like. And then therefore it is an important kind of playing field for us to be part and have our say. Well, of course, when we think that we are a major player in the industry, then of course we want to kind of set the tone and be be seen as a leader that we are in certain areas. So therefore it becomes mandatory for us to be there. We just can't stay out and kind of look from the sidelines. So there are kind of sort of internal motivations for Nokia to be part of these communities and help them to achieve what they want. I think this one is a bit busy and maybe not the easiest to read, but it kind of goes back to that industry alignment, and actually very much goes back to that. So the top part of the picture kind of gives you an idea that Nokia works and develops products and solutions to something that is built out of multiple different vendors' solutions. So it is something that we cannot even dream to be the only one who provides the products and solutions. So there has to be some way of interoperability, be it for the telecom operators, be it for the enterprises, or whatever is the target customer. So we need to be able to play with the competitor devices. So that can then kind of, in sort of more technical terms, translates into open system interfaces and APIs. Sort of like, how do you interface these two things? So Ethernet cable is a good example, concrete example. So there is a very good standard for that. You take the cable and you plug it into your PC. There's the open interface. And so kind of on a programmatic level, we also do these things. So that's what we do. And open source at Nokia is seen as part of that openness game. So it's not all of it. It's just one part. Like we see here, standardization, folks. That's a big deal. A lot of that interoperability and openness happens there. But also open source is, especially recently, like a recent decade, has become more and more prominent in that domain. So they do complement each other. And then of course we do have our own Nokia partner ecosystem that brings another flavor to the openness. But all these things put together, we are able to help the industry to build the open and interoperable solutions that then serves the wider audience. Like you place your mobile phone call and it works, because even if there's like 6 different company devices in between you and your partner that you call with. So that's the kind of the big picture within Nokia for open source, this openness. And I think we are a little bit misusing our time budget here, so I will wrap up here. Just giving you a couple of links to projects that Nokia is or has been recently the most active in way of contributing. So the pictures are links, and then you can go and find out what they are about. And then of course in GitHub, Nokia GitHub, you can see plenty of them if interested. So I think that's a place where you now can try to be quick, take a picture, and send your questions if you didn't manage at the beginning. So I give you maybe 5 more seconds to grab your phones and take the picture. And we'll conclude here, turn over to the next phase of the presentation.
Hello everybody, my name is Veli-Pekka Loma from Mobile Networks Technology Center, and I will talk about open career positions at Nokia. So Nokia is a strong growth phase at the moment. We are seeking junior and senior experts and talents to join us, and we have many open positions available. And where we are operating in 3 locations in Finland, so Tampere, Oulu and Espoo. Tampere specialized in network management, system on chip issues, and claimed to be the coolest and greenest site in Nokia. Oulu is a home of radio, specialized very much on the radio, and as example, the leading the 6G development in globally in our organization. And we are here at Espoo, which is the headquarters of Nokia, global headquarters. We have all our business groups present here and very extensive activities at the Espoo site and very many open positions at Espoo as well. And we are working in a hybrid mode, so partially remotely as well, especially in these corona times, but also learning new ways of working so that part of the work is active on a site and part of the work can be remotely executed, depending on the role and also the working styles of per the employee. The skills that we are after, the list is long, but you doesn't have to be an expert on all of things, but if you actually can click some of these skills, that could be very favorable for you to join to the Nokia family. Digital signal processing, 5G, 4G, telecommunications, embedded software, machine learning, artificial intelligence, among other. So if one of these is your interest or core competence, that could be very potentially you could find your career position with us. The working skills, software languages that we are actively using, Java, JavaScript, Jenkins, MATLAB, C, C++, Python, and some others are actively used. And with the tools, testing automation, GitHub, Jenkins, DevOps and continuous delivery, and such tools are actively used in Nokia. The meta skills being kind of a productive part of the organization and enjoying your work. We are, of course, adapt to the different working styles for the persons, but we are team-oriented organization, so group working skills and networking and collaboration, it is helping us to create the kind of complex environment, complex technology, and enjoy working with that. Presentation skills, you can learn if you have not the masters there. Self-leadership, so to be innovative, to be creative. You can also adapt your personal style in working and influencing others while working. Interested and great attitude of learning new things. That's natural and very kind of learning space is full of different kind of courses with Nokia. So thousands of different courses available for you to learn while working. Agile thinking, statistical analysis skills, information searching, different channels, different ways, and ability to apply the mathematical theories and systematic thinking. So different kind of meta skills, introvert and extroverts, different kind of personality works well with us, and welcoming different personalities as well. Mainly what we are after at the moment are software developers and system on chip developers, also very many open positions in the testing side. Now active are the summer training positions and various other positions. I would guide you to take a look on the career opportunities in Finland. There are various and long lists of opportunities and promoting the tactics over there, that looking after the many different options of your interest and career opportunities that you could fit and you would be interested, and potentially filing more than one application to the different positions, as there are multiple managers recruiting. So if you have observed many opportunities that could interest you, just to send multiple applications. So this one about the career opportunities, and then we move to the panel discussion. Thank you. Let's actually introduce our panel here. I said myself, I'm Veli-Pekka Luoma, working in Technology Center Mobile Networks. And here with me are Timo, Turalf, Anna, Tommi, and Gregory. So if you could introduce yourself very quickly in a 2 minutes, that who are you and why you are sitting in the panel of open source. So Timo, you go first.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, like I said in the beginning of my part of the presentation, I work at the CTO office of Nokia, kind of open source program office. So that kind of justifies why I sit here. I've been working for Nokia now a very long time. Most of the time I've been with some flavor of industry collaboration work. So working either with partners, competitors, customers. First from product perspective, then from standardization quite some time, and now for the last 6 years maybe on open source. So that's kind of my career path in a nutshell.
Thank you. Turalf.
Yeah, so my name is Turalf Jihi. I'm a developer and software architect by heart, and have been now working for about 3 years in an open source project, the Open Run, in the Open Run software community, on a product or on a project called the near real-time RIC, Run Intelligent Controller, which is the concept of the Open Run Alliance, the ORAN Alliance. I'm working there as the project technical lead, organizing project meetings, but also writing code, reviewing code, and coordinating the work between the developers.
Thank you. So Anna Hypola is my name. I am a legal counsel at Nokia, working here for more or less 4 years now. My role in this panel discussion, I believe, is then to represent sort of the legal support given to the people involved with open source at Nokia. And basically my role is to both give advice on the different open source software licenses, as well as then when we're contributing or even founding open source communities, that what should we take into consideration from the legal point of view. Glad to be here.
Tommi.
Hello, my name is Tommi Rantala, and I've been 5 years at Nokia as a software engineer. And in my team, we are building a software platform, so very much inspired by the Federal Linux distribution, and is that then gets used by certain Nokia cloud-based products, and so very much hands-on work with basically hundreds of open source components and working with virtual machines and containers and these kind of things. And my journey with open source started in 2003. So back then I was a student at University of Helsinki, and I remember setting some patches out to the internet and so on. And back then I decided that I want to do this open source, and I was very interested in Linux and so on. And since then, and over the years, I've contributed to dozens of open source projects, including the Linux kernel, and in some projects I've done more and in some less. And for example, in projects like System DMPC box, I've contributed like 1 or 2 patches there and so on. So, thank you.
Okay.
So as I mentioned in the presentation, my name is Gregory and I'm working in the same group as Timo, in the central open source program office group in Nokia. I did in my very long career in Nokia some software development and then some software architecture, and then I moved to this industry collaboration area. I was doing a little bit of standardization, but then I moved to this borderline basically of standardization and open source, and I was working there a bit. And now in my current role, among many other things, I'm co-chairing the technical steering committee of Anuket, which is one interesting project for us in Nokia, and I'm doing most of my contributions to Anuket.
Thank you. As we learned in the presentation, open source is a kind of modern and versatile way of creating software and creating technology. But how in relative terms we could actually consider how valuable is the knowledge of open source inside Nokia or outside Nokia?
So I think a knowledge to use open source is very valuable because as I tried to cover it a bit in the presentation, nowadays it's an essential tool in the toolbox of a software developer to use open source projects, to find the correct project, and not in technical terms, but also from other open source related aspects, like for example, is the project is maintained, are there security patches? All of these things are very important in the world of open source, and if somebody just selects an open source to be used in their product, it will be part of the product. So if that project is not maintained, then it is a very big problem. So all of these things are very important, and contributing to open source, as Timo mentioned in the presentation, is a tool in Nokia and in other companies also to take part in this shared R&D, to influence the industry, and to build this industry consensus. And to all of these, it's very important to have developers who have the capability to negotiate, the capability to argue in a civilized way in the public, so we can deliver our contributions to these projects.
Is it restricted only for the software developers, if you think about, to get their hands on the open source and the way of creating technology using open source? Is it just for coders?
Well, maybe I can start with that because my immediate answer to all of you is definitely not. My background is in computer science, but my best before date is long overdue. I wouldn't even dream of bringing patches or trying to merge anything in code. But fortunately, and especially in Nokia, there is other opportunities, like Gecko already mentioned testing and documentation in the presentation. But then we do have all these other kind of organizational aspects, like somebody has to make sure that the projects run properly, so the governance needs to be there. And the human factors, like when you have a dozen or 24 people in the room representing different companies, it's an interesting negotiation game. And you need to be able to, first of all, tolerate that, but then also be able to deliver kind of what is important for the company or yourself at the time. So multiple different opportunities, not only software coding.
But you, Timo, you referred to that there's some age limitations in being a coder. So,
No, definitely not. I mean,
so that is that.
there is not. It's just me. I haven't kept up my skills.
Okay. How about Tuula?
Yeah, that's important. So you have to keep up your game. So you have to continuously follow what's happening in terms of technology. But kind of what kind of skills you need, they're very similar to what you would need when you work for a company. And so there are clearly developers needed, testing. We do continuous integration. I think in one of you mentioned in the presentation, Jenkins is clearly a thing that you need to know how to use. What else? And social skills are very, very important. You tend to work with many nationalities by now. In the project I'm working on, there are from Brazil, the US, Asia, all the countries, even Africa. We have participants there. They have really different cultural background. You have to deal with them. You have to motivate them. There are different things that motivates them. than maybe myself. And I learned that over the last 3 years, and I think everybody can learn it. And it's an interesting thing that you learn maybe more in an open source project than within a single company where there are only a few sites typically that you work with.
I can also comment from the legal field that for sure open source knowledge is very useful for a lawyer, not only if you were to give advice in this area, but just to understand copyright, understand software licenses more broadly. And I actually heard from some colleagues who, for example, did their legal traineeship at Nokia, that when they went to work in other companies, it was a very useful knowledge that they could then apply in other companies as well. Plus, then one thing that someone said that I thought was very clever was that just in general learning something totally new, because in law school you don't really learn so much about open source. It's a totally new world for a lawyer who doesn't have technical background. So just grasping a completely new concept and understanding it, that's a great skill that you can show anywhere. And I think this is also true to anyone, not just lawyers or coders, but just anyone working with this topic.
Yes, it's a business model, and also the legal
Yes.
aspects are important on that one. How then the open source technology environment and toolbox, how that is actually helping you as a contributing developer? How about you, Rafa?
How it's helping me as a contributor. The open source, what it helps me is, of course, it shortens my development times. Whatever, if I have the possibility to use open source, I will do that. If it's legally okay, if there's a reasonable business case behind it. How I, as a contributing developer, can then help with the project others, that's another angle. And in our project, how we help is that we actually help standardization. So we want the standardization where, again, there are 200 companies behind the Oron Alliance, and all of them want to drive them in the direction they have their products being developed. With the open source project that we do, we can very well argue in standardization. This is the way we would like to drive the standardization. Here you can see the reference implementation in open source, in source code. You can check yourself, this is working. Let's do it in the standard this way. That's how we help, and how we contribute then from the open source community to the standardization.
Yes, important link. Then what makes a successful open source project? How to get started and get traction for it?
That is a very good question, and I think it's very important for anybody who would like to start an open source project, because it's very easy to create something on GitHub and do something on your own, and that is an open source project. But the real benefit of open source, and I think the real goodness of open source, is the collaboration angle. And for that, the open source project needs to be ready to consume. So it has to have a documentation which describes in easy steps how to use the open source project. It has to have a documentation which describes how to contribute to the project. Also, it have to be easy to use. So if you need to, build the project for a day and then you just can't use it, it just drives users away. So they will just find the next one. So this is why documentation is very important in open source projects, because that's an enabler to get users, and getting users is an enabler to get contributors.
I can support that. Yeah, it's to the users. You get contributions from users, and some of the users will become contributors, and you need to make it as easy as possible to become a user and then maybe subsequently a contributor. Code of conduct is one thing that maybe attracts contributors, so they know before you start using a project and then also contributing, you know how the project behaves, how it's steered, what kind of project meetings there are. Is there a cultural fit between you and the other members in the project? So all of this is very important to get track behind an open source project. Maybe the other thing, how to get an open source project started, if it's not a simple one or not a small one, but a complex one. You want to get out of this corner where there's only a single contributing company behind an open source project or a single person. In the project that I'm working on, we started actually together with another company to provide seed code. We started in January 2019, and within 4 months in May, we did have our first seed code, and from there on, it was an open source project, a pure open source project. Anybody could contribute. By now, we have about 10 companies contributing to the source code. Also, because it's a social experience, and everybody can come and contribute. And it's not only companies; it's also universities that contribute, which is maybe something we forgot a bit to mention in the presentation today.
Yes.
Universities are a great source of contributors to open source projects.
Maybe just quickly adding that I have this mantra about this successful open source projects. It's like we talk about shared R&D, so you need to have a shared understanding of the problem you are tackling. So that's kind of a starting point. That everybody huddles around the same issue, approximately at least. And then this diverse contributor community. So you have to have kind of a balanced critical mass. So it's not one company driven or anything like that. It's not usually very successful. And then what Turaf was mentioning, this code of conduct or the kind of the governance thing, that it has to be, at least it has to be transparent so that everybody understands why the decisions are made the way they are made. They may be unhappy about it, but at least they know how it's done, and then they may be able to improve it. But so kind of, it comes a lot about culture, seems to be.
Many key elements mentioned. Any other components that we need for the full governance project, and what is the importance of the governance model for the OC project?
I think transparency is the key. That you can have any governance model of the project, but if it's not transparent to the contributors, they will not understand how decisions are made, and that makes people frustrated. So even if you have a dictator in the project, that should be clear that who is the dictator and how to change that. I think that's the key in governance.
Yeah, I think that's definitely. I mean, it is an equal world in a way. I mean, even if Gergo talks about the dictator, it's still like everybody is on the same footing there. So it's like it has to be again commonly agreed if somebody is allowed to call the decisions, so that everybody is happy with that way of working. So yeah, I think you need to treat everybody decently and with equal footing.
Is anyone allowed to contribute anything to open source projects, or is it truly open or somehow limited? How about Tom?
Yeah, so well, of course, you always have to be a bit careful, at least when you are contributing to some new project. So at least to check that the license is okay. At least my personal experience at Nokia has been very positive, so that I've been able to contribute pretty much what I wanted. So I think some projects do have this kind of like this CLAs that require some signing, so those are a bit special cases, but otherwise very good.
I think
So maybe I can also comment. I think from the others, so if there's a contributor coming and wants to contribute something, usually as a project you are happy that there is a contributor and you want to support them. So definitely this is something the project should be open to contributors and be happy about every contributor, and of course invest a bit of time into steering them into the right direction on where code contributions are needed, how they are supposed to be contributed, in what kind of format. So a bit of steering you can expect, but of course as a contributor you're supposed to deliver something, to contribute value, and that's what's expected.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the CLAs and this kind of things, like companies usually have some kind of policies around how and where to contribute, and I think it's very important to have a policy what the employees of the company can understand, and it's clear for them, for example, who to ask if something is not clear, because of course, like open source is really in the borderline of engineering and legal, and I think it's as Anna mentioned, it's a very unique mix of competencies. So there are lots of questions usually, and it can really hurt a company if somebody like signs a bad CLA. So this is why we try to be liberal in that sense, that like anybody is contributing what they want, but at the same time we are really putting an effort into checking what is contributed. So I'm pretty sure that Tomi's contribution ideas were checked, and we had the legal checking on the CLAs, for example, and so on.
And this was handled in the presentation, but let's highlight, because it's important for the business, that what are the motivations of the companies like Nokia to use and contribute to the open source. Especially if you think about, we are working in telecommunications, that standardization is very important, so that interlinking the kind of open source to standardization is a critical. So once again, what is the motivation for Nokia to work with and contribute to the open source?
So it's threefold, let's say. One is the using the benefits of this shared R&D. So there are open source projects which are really like part of our products, because we are integrating them to our products. And for example, the team where Tom is working, they are using these open source projects. And of course, sometimes we find bugs there, or we just find something, but we need to enhance there. And we are using open source to make these changes, because if we would keep these changes to ourselves, then we would start to derive from the upstream project, what would mean that to get the changes what the upstream project is doing, we would need continuously to synchronize, and that is not a good long-term strategy. Then the second thing is that we use open source for industry alignment. So there are open source projects which are working, or which have pretty much the same target as standardization, like let's have an agreement on something and use open source technologies and open source methods of agreeing to achieve that. And we are active in these projects. For example, this Anuket project where I'm active is partly about this. So we are basically writing the specification in open source. And then, as Timo mentioned in the presentation, we are technology leaders, so we need to lead the technology, which is happening in open source in many cases.
Yes. Great kind of summary. How about then the licensing and the legal issues? So Anna, what licenses are preferred at Nokia? How we would approach that?
We don't really have like a preference that, or some standard license that we would always, for example, prefer if we use some code that it's always under this certain license, or that if we contribute to a project that we require that it's under a certain license. I'd say it's more or less a case-by-case analysis, although maybe of course there are like some generalizations that we're able to make there. But I think that's also partly, we just want to be flexible, and we want to kind of enable as much freedom as we can. So I think I cannot really answer with any preference, but just that we are flexible.
Okay, flexible and case by case. Then, what is the most kind of interesting project that you have been involved related to the open source? Could be historical or current, or even planned. If you could share that. So, what are the good memories out of this?
It's always the project I'm working on. No,
that's a good motivation.
But in the project, one thing I noticed, maybe some of you have. It's a familiar project, the robot framework project, which is a test framework. And that was started maybe almost 15 years ago, and by Nokia, or heavy involvement of Nokia. And I have almost completely forgotten about it over the last 10 years. And now I've actually run into the same robot test framework again when our partner in writing the seed code, AT&T, was actually proposing to use it. So that's a good motivation that you see that projects that were started as open source projects actually are still alive. They are working. They're heavily used. I quickly Googled it. It's the 7th most used test framework nowadays. So there are clearly also others. But it's good to see that open source projects that we started are still used and by others that you wouldn't expect maybe them to use it. Another project is obviously more closer to what I'm doing now. We are developing the Run Intelligent Controller platform, and on top of this platform you can develop so-called XApps that are applications that steer the radio access network, and there are many interesting projects happening under the O1SC umbrella, but also outside of it. So very interesting projects that work with the RUN, with the radio access network, to optimize the resources of the RUN, for example.
Thank you. Other memories and highlights?
Yeah, maybe I can say that it's pretty cool thought that, for example, those contributions that I've done, that they are shipped to billions of these Linux-based devices and what kind of.
Is it on my phone?
If you use Android, then yes.
Great. I was thinking kind of from maybe, hopefully it's not a turn down, but it's like, in my experience, the projects that that I've been involved with, they have kind of a fairly concise life cycle compared to, for example, Linux. So they are there for some years, some longer, some shorter time, but definitely not as long as, for example, Linux. So I kind of approach this question from the angle that you need to be able to kill your darlings. So there's something that is fun for a time, and then there will be a next one. That seems to be the name of the game, at least at the telco industry. So that's. It doesn't say that I don't mean to say that I'm kind of eagerly waiting to kill my darling, but you just need to move on.
So a constant evolution.
Indeed, and I just have to say now that I have a soft spot with Linux on my left side because I spent some time along the same corridor at the computer science department as Linus.
Emotional attachment.
Exactly, big time.
Okay. Thank you. Some questions from the audience. Does Nokia use any open source vulnerability? This is a difficult word. And license scanning tools like Black Duck? Specific question.
Yes. The specific answer is yes.
Answer is yes. Thank you. Very efficient. Let's be efficient. But back to the legal. What about the trademarks? We discussed about the licenses, but Anna, you have a comment on the controlling and the trademarks on the products.
I think it's a little bit complex question, so I'll be only able to kind of give you a very short, high-level overview. But it is true that certain very commonly used open source software licenses explicitly say that they don't grant any rights to any trademarks. So then if some open source software project has actually trademark, for example, the name or like a word mark or a logo or something, then it can cause a lot of confusion, because if you're kind of from the copyright angle very liberal that please use this code, but then you're still trying to limit through the trademark avenue, this can create some confusion. But in any case, I think the comment is that there are certain projects where the trademark questions are an issue, and then of course we will have to, for example, in the corporate life, just then analyze them again case by case. But that was a good question, by the way.
That was a good question actually. Yes. For the whole business model. Then how do you cope with the complexity, volume of projects, and rate of change in open source? AI as an example from Mike was on the same team. So coping with complexity, volume of projects, and rate of change in open source.
That's a difficult question, again a very good question. I think our coping method is that we are trying to select open source projects what we are using not randomly. So like projects which are maintained, and projects which have some kind of a roadmap which is aligned with our needs. But of course that's a difficult thing, because this is like really a big volume thing. So where we are literally using thousands of open source projects in the different Nokia products.
I don't know if it is an answer at all to the question, but I think it's kind of at least a two-pronged approach. That there is the team where Gregory and me belong to, so our task is to try to help the company to hurt the cats. But then of course we have like our developers here, so the kind of the interest also comes from the, well, let's use grassroots. I don't know if that's a very polite way to describe it anyway, so kind of from the need. And then these need to we need to work together. So there are people who are interested in something, who need something, and they observe that these some projects are more interesting than others from those thousands. And then we should be able to help to kind of pick the ones that are
Prioritization on
that as well.
Yeah, in a way, open source makes this a bit easier also, because I mean this is an AI ML. It's a hot topic. There are thousands of companies working on it. If you would have to talk to each of these proprietary solutions one by one, it would consume a lot more time than comparing open source solutions if they are available for particular algorithms, for example. So this kind of rate of change is in an open source community maybe easier to deal with than actually in a proprietary solutions.
Thank you. A specific question: would Nokia R&D would be allowed to modify, for example, in a change bug fix, an LGBL2 licensed library and distribute the library to the customer with open source code availability of a fixed licensed library? Specific question, if you could pick up and comment on that one.
Very specific indeed, I guess that's kind of to me. Well, I think this would again have to be analyzed, like what is your modification and so forth, because like one of the kind of attributes of this, for example, this LGPL license that was mentioned, is that when you modify this software, then this license sort of inherited by those modifications. So then your only way of distributing it forward is under that original open source license, which then of course we have to consider as a company, are we willing to license this modification under this license? So yeah, that's very short, but would require again
the case analysis.
Yeah.
Okay, that was basically all the questions from the audience. So then we start to be finished with the slot and show from this time. We thank our presenters and panelists. And from the audience, we inspire you to take a look on the career pages of Nokia, selecting the winner one for you to select and join the family. So thank you everyone, and thank you to the audience, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.